good news that the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the creator of all things, is for us and not against us? The God of creator and the heavens and the earth is for you and not against you. The one who holds all things in the palm of his hands is for you and not against you. Man, that is powerful, and that is such good news. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I'm running uphill with 100 pounds on my back. But to know that the Lord, the creator of the heavens and the earth, is for me, I can shout louder than this thing. Am I on now? What is going on? Okay, that's my fault. That's Stacy's fault. It's just amazing to me how we can sing a song, and I find myself just sitting there having to repeat myself over and over again as being led by the worship team. And I think repetition is important because it gets us in a mindset of realizing what we are singing, what we are praying. Singing and praying something as powerful as the Lord is for us and not against us changes things, y'all. It changes our demeanor, it changes our mindset, it changes who we are from the outside looking in and from the inside looking out. The truth of the gospel is that God is for you and not against you. The creator of heavens and the earth is for you and not against you. And we can preach a whole sermon on that, but that's not the sermon title or the sermon for today. Today's sermon title, if you are taking notes, is whose house are you living in? Look at your neighbor and say, whose house are you living in? And yes, that was supposed to be a little awkward. Whose house are you living in? I find it amazing as I begin to know more and more folks in this community and begin to develop relationships with you, how impactful and how important the homes that we live in and the homes that we grew up in are to us. We are shaped in the homes that we were brought up in. We are shaped by the homes that we live in. Whether you grew up in a home that was spotless and always playing meditation music in the background, and there was always tea or something calming on the burners or whatever it is, or whether you grew up in a house like mine where there was always loud music and my mom was yelling at one of her kids. Not me though, because I'm the oldest, and as the oldest, we are always good and always sweet and clean. What homes did you grow up in, and how did that shape you? I bet if I asked you that question, how did the home that you grew up in shape you, I bet you could tell me a million of things. And I think, friends, as we look at our passage today, we are going to see that the homes that we live in continue to shape us now. We're going to be looking at the house of law and the house of grace. Look at your neighbor and say the house of law. Look at your other neighbor and say the house of grace. That's good. That's good. I hope you're sitting by somebody, because talking to yourself might, We're going to be looking at Galatians 3, starting at verse 26. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Usually I read from the NRSV, but I like the New Living Translation a little bit better. Sometimes, certain translations make things a little more complicated than they need to be. The New Living Translation, if you don't have a Bible or if you're new to reading Scripture, I recommend reading the New Living Translation. It's just an easy read. It's a good read for us to kind of look through maybe some of the more religious terms as Carlos would use it. Can we give a round of applause for Carlos? Bring you up here someday. You're going to have to preach me down to my pew. You're going to have to preach before me. So I appreciated that. Why I appreciated that is because there's just joy. And sometimes I think in church we can get so caught up in the do's and don'ts and the what's and what's nots, but you just have so much joy, and I appreciate that about you, Carlos, so thank you. Anyways, Galatians 3, 26, 4 through 7. And before we read that, I got one more, side comment. Fans. I figured we can put on the fan so you all would be just a little less uncomfortable. We are working on air conditioning, y'all. We are working on air conditioning. Pray for that. I'm serious. Pray for that in the name of Jesus, that we get some air conditioning real quick before August. We're going to believe in a miracle. We're also getting the bathrooms fixed downstairs, so men's bathrooms is up here. It's the beauty of living and doing worship and doing life in this amazing building. There's just some transitions that we're working through, so thank you for your patience on that. All right, for real now. Galatians 3, yes. Yes. AC, amen. Yes, in the name of Jesus. Yes. Galatians 3:26. For you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus, and all who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on Christ, like putting on new clothes. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Can I get an amen? And now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. Think of it this way. If a father dies and leaves an inheritance for his young children, those children are not much better off than slaves until they grow up, even though they actually own everything their father had. They have to obey their guardians until they reach whatever age their father set. And that's the way it was with us before Christ came. We are like children. We are slaves to the basic spiritual principles of this world. But when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law so that he could adopt us as his very own children. And because we are his children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. Now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you are his child, God has made you his heir. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it is encouraging to us in times and in seasons where we need a word of encouragement. But we also thank you, Lord, that your word is challenging to us, and it calls us to live the lives that you are calling us to live. So, Lord, I pray that you allow us to open up our hearts. I pray that you allow us to open up our minds. I pray that you allow us to open up our ears to hear what your Spirit wants to impart into us today, Lord. I pray that you be with me, let my mouth be your mouth, let my mind be your mind, let my body be your body, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. There's a lot going on in this passage, y'all. Had a lot of fun reading through it, looking at every comma, looking at every period, looking at every capitalized word. There's a lot going on in this. And if you're reading Galatians with us, you probably saw that there was just a lot going on in this passage. Again, Paul, if you are with us, we're reading through the book of Galatians, and Paul is writing to the Gentile people and telling them that they are the children of God. This is a complete paradigm shift for the Gentiles, because for all of their lives they've been told that they are nothing, they will never amount to nothing, and they definitely will not have a relationship with God, because that was only for the chosen people, that was only for the Israelites, that was only for the people who God created a covenant with, a promise with. But Paul comes and tells people that there was no more hierarchy in the kingdom of God. There was no longer Jew, there was no longer Greek, there was no longer Gentile, there was no longer slave, there was no longer male, there's no longer female, there's no longer documented or undocumented. Oh wait, I don't think I saw that. But maybe, I think that stands here too. There is no longer people who are somehow on the outside looking in. God has invited all people into a relationship with him, and we as a church are called to break down the hierarchies and to break down the paradigms that keep the structure of people who are on the outside looking in. And I don't know about you folks, but if you are watching the news and seeing how kids are being treated and being put in cages, that has to break your heart. Because what we know about Jesus is that Jesus has invited all of us to care for the least of these in our community. And Paul telling us that there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer Gentile or Jew, there is no more hierarchy. And Paul invites us to break down those hierarchies in our communities, in our culture, and most definitely in our church, friends, because if it's not in our church, then it will never be lived out outside of this place. Then Paul invites us to consider the promise that he gave to Abraham. Now, this is a promise that we have been talking about for some time now, since we've been in the Galatians sermon series. And I felt that it was important for us to read exactly where this covenant began. And it was in Genesis 17, starting at verse 5. And you can
turn there, but I'm going to read it for you just to make it a little easier on you. But write it down, read it throughout the week, and it reads like this. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestors of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant or promise between me and you, God tells Abraham, and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. This is the covenant that God has made to Abraham, and this is the covenant that continues until the time Paul steps on the scenes and begins to preach a gospel of liberation for the people who are on the outside looking in. Jesus died, Jesus sacrificed, Jesus laid his life on the line and on the cross for everyone to have a relationship with him. And through Paul's words and through the gospel, people were able to say that there is no longer hierarchy, there is no longer people who are on the outside looking in, there is no longer children of God and no longer children of God. If you believe in Jesus Christ, if you've been baptized, you are a child of God, Paul says. But then we ask the question, well, whose house are you living in? Because something fascinating happens in verse 4, 1 through 3. We have this metaphor of Paul saying it's kind of like everyone is chasing after this inheritance, this promise, this grace that God has extended to us through Jesus Christ. Everyone is chasing after this inheritance of grace, but somehow we are kind of caught in bondage, and we are caught in a house with guardians that doesn't want to give it to us yet. He uses this example of a child whose father passed away, and the father wanted to give his inheritance to the child, but the child was too young to receive the inheritance, so he or she had to live in the house and be watched over by the guardian, and the guardian would make sure that the person, the child, would do all that they needed to do in order to receive the inheritance. Doesn't that sound like a house of law? But what Paul invites us into later on in verse 4 is a house of grace, a house that reminds us that through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, we are able to be united with Christ, regardless of our sin, regardless of our brokenness, regardless of how the ways we continue to act when we know we shouldn't act like that. God invites us into the house of grace. But friends, I don't know about you, but I oftentimes find myself in the house of law. And I think Paul understood that by sharing with us this metaphor. I mean, think about it. Imagine if you were the child who was given an inheritance, and all of a sudden you weren't able to receive the inheritance when you knew you should have received the inheritance. Everything was yours that your father left you, but all of a sudden you have to be working for it. You have to act a certain way. You have to do certain things up into a certain age in order for you to receive what is already yours. Wouldn't that be frustrating? Wouldn't you be a little angry? Wouldn't you sense a little injustice just deep within your soul that the thing that should be given to you is not given to you because it is just not time? And not only that, you have to do certain things in order to receive the inheritance that your father has left you. The constant looking over your back, making sure that the guardian sees you doing all the things that you are doing in order to receive this inheritance. The constant making sure at the end of the night, making sure that your goods outweigh the bads. The constant checking the scoreboard just to make sure that you are doing more right than wrong. And if we did more right than wrong, then of course we would allow ourselves to receive the inheritance. But for some reason, we keep ourselves in the house of law. Whether it be because of external reasons or internal reasons. And friends, today I want to talk about the internal reasons of why we keep ourselves in the house of the law. Why we continue to live lives of looking over our shoulder, making sure that people see that we are doing good, making sure that our goods outweigh the bads, and making sure that we're praying to God and doing things for God so that we can earn God's inheritance. And what is this inheritance that you and I are to receive? It is the house of grace. It is the grace that continues to liberate us, but for some reason we remain trapped in this house of law. So what traps you in your house of law? Is it the idea that you have to work more? Is it the idea that you have to continue to spend long days and long nights and long weekends at your job just so that you can get the promotion that you want? And if you got the promotion, then you'd be able to buy the car, you'd be able to buy the house, or you'd be able to buy the clothes, or you would be able to save enough money for retirement. And if you got enough money for retirement, then you would be able to live a life full of inheritance and full of grace. But once we continue to live our lives full of work and continuing to try to earn our approval, then once we get to the place of retirement, if we get to the place of retirement, then we realize that there is no one to retire with. It's this continual working to earn the inheritance. Or maybe you are a new Christian, or you're considering Christianity, and you come and you sit in the pew and you sing these songs and you hear a preacher preach a word of grace and law and how they kind of hold in tension with each other, and you feel like in order to get yourself right with God, and in order to be a part of the community, in order to be a part of the whole body of Christ, you feel like you have to get yourself right before you could ever come to God, because God can't handle your mess. God can't handle your sin. And so when we live in the house of law, we feel like we have to clean ourselves up. We have to say certain things. We have to do certain things. We have to pray a certain way. We have to talk a certain way. We have to act a certain way, because God could never take us as we are. This is what the house of law tells us when we live and dwell in the house of law. Or maybe you have been a Christian for some time, or you've been a Christian all of your life, and the house of the law seems comfortable to you. It seems as though not only are you the child who continues to look over the back of their shoulder, but they are also the guardian who likes to externally or internally be the person to say, you are in right with God, or you not in right with God. You are the person who sits on your porch and watches people as they mow their lawns on Sundays. If we still do that, do we still do that? I think so. Maybe it's not that, but maybe it's the way somebody acts on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, or maybe it's the way that you notice somebody giving you a dirty look when really they didn't give you a dirty look, they just had something in their nose. You know what I'm saying? As Christians, I think we like it to be the person who seems to be the guardian because we feel like we have it all together. But in reality, it's just a defense mechanism to truly engage in community. And I think we as Christians, even we as seasoned vets, even we as people who come to church and serve, we like to keep some distance from the community. And yeah, we can say that we're authentic, and yeah, we can say that we are vulnerable because we've read people or we watch people on YouTube like Brene Brown and other people, and so we know all of the catchy and sexy words that allows us to be a part of the Christian community. But for some reason, I think that some of us live in the sense of law because yes, we can say we're vulnerable, and yes, we can say we're authentic, but we're just vulnerable enough. And we're just authentic enough to save face. It's funny how when we're in a Christian environment for so long, we begin to learn the things that we need to do to be successful or to fit in. But I am finding all too often that we're learning these words and we're learning what to do or what not to do, but in reality, we're protecting ourselves a little bit from actually engaging in Scripture and actually engaging in community because we're really afraid. We're really afraid of being found out. Look at your neighbor and say, found out. You gotta say that a little bit. That's good. We're really afraid of being found out because if we're found out, then people won't approve. We're really afraid of being intimate with Jesus because if we're intimate with Jesus and we really go there with Jesus, we're really afraid of how God might change our lives and how God might change our hearts and how God might change the way that we live and act, not only in our community, not only in our houses, but in the house of the Lord. That is scary. Change is scary. Change is scary because we lose control. And so we would prefer to live in the house of the law and say things like, yes, we're vulnerable, and yes, we can pray together, and yes, we can read Scripture together. But friends, as a community, are we really able to let down our guard? move away from trying to find everybody's approval and really engage and getting to know each other. And most importantly, friends, I think at the crux of it, it's actually being known. When we are living in the house of law, being known is the last thing that we ever want. Because we're afraid of approval. We're afraid of whether people are actually going to interact with us. We're afraid if we're actually going to be invited over to the 4th of July potluck or barbecue, whatever it may be. Living in the house of the law is exhausting. Continually looking over your shoulder, continually playing the mind games in your head. I gotta do more, I gotta be more, I gotta do something else in order for me to be accepted and fit in. And all of a sudden, Jesus invites us into the house of grace. Jesus invites us into the house of grace. Jesus invites us into the house of grace so that we can love each other. And so most importantly, we can love God. And we love God because God first loved us. God sacrificed His one and only Son so that we can live in the house of grace, so that we can flourish and dwell in the house of grace, so that we can no longer be identified by how we work and what we work for. And we can no longer be identified for what we have or what we do not have. We can no longer be identified for what we do and do not do. We are only identified by being a child of God. And there is no hierarchy in the kingdom of God. There is no hierarchy in the house of grace. There are just children of God. We're all broken and busted and confused and trying to go on this path of discipleship. And this path of discipleship is one that we have to continue to keep going to. It takes consistency. It takes discipline. It takes being broken and falling down and getting right back up, because we know that in the house of grace, we are made right with God, not because of what we do, but because of what Christ has done on the cross. But this inheritance thing is interesting, because I think we all have this mindset of we have to earn this inheritance of grace that God has given us. You struggle with it. I struggle with it. And as I thought about Scripture, as I thought about Jesus' life, and as I thought about Jesus' words, I was brought back to an older story, and maybe you've heard of it. It's the story of a prodigal son. There's a father who had two sons. The older son, who was perfect and never made any issues with his father. I can say this because I'm the oldest of 7, so the oldest son is always the best, right? Amen? Yes? No? Okay. I heard a no. That's okay. And then we have the youngest son who kind of rebelled. He was a person that wanted to create his own path. He wanted to journey on his own road. And so he asked his father for his inheritance early. And so he cashed out of his inheritance. And he went and lived life the way that he wanted to live his life. And it wasn't too long until he realized that he took his inheritance for granted, and he found himself busted and disgusted and started to feed pigs because he had no more money. And he had this realization that as he was feeding these pigs, that he could feed his father's pigs and probably not eat the food that the pigs were eating because he had lost so much money that he was starting to eat the pigs' food. He went back home, and as he was journeying back home, I'm sure that all of the things that the house of the law brings on to somebody, I'm sure he was struggling with that. I'm sure that as he was looking down, journeying home, he had the issues of condemnation, which is a religious word. Thank you, Carlos, for guilt. He had issues of failure. He had thoughts of maybe, what will my father say of me as I go home? Will he accept me, or will he just tell me to turn around and walk the other way? I'm sure he had the wonderings of, is he actually good enough to earn his father's love once again, even though he took his father's inheritance and told him that I want to do this on my own. I wondered if he thought that would his father really accept him and love him, even though he just blew all of his inheritance? And what is interesting about this story, and this is why I believe this is a house of grace story, is that as the son was walking to the house, the father wasn't chasing after him with a chancla or with a belt or anything like that. He was chasing after him with a cloak, and he welcomed him with open arms and threw a party for him. When we live in the house of grace, friends, we have to understand that just like the prodigal son, sometimes we take the grace for granted. Just like the prodigal son, we can take the grace and say, thank you, grace. I'm going to take this and I'm going to go to church on Sunday, maybe, or maybe I'll read my Bible, or maybe I'll join a life group, or maybe I'll serve, but I'm going to take this grace and do what I want to do with this grace. And yes, I know that you have sacrificed everything you have, everything that you had, God. You sent your one and only son, but I'm going to take this grace and I'm going to do whatever I want with this grace, and I'm just going to say that I live in the house of grace. But what we see in the prodigal son is that we can take advantage of this grace, and all of a sudden this grace can become cheap. What's cheap grace? Cheap grace is something that we can receive, something that we can take, forgetting that there was an actual sacrifice for this grace. Cheap grace is something that we can receive, but actually does nothing for us. It's like, again, receiving a gift, but not taking it out of the box and trying it on, because when we try on grace and when we take grace out of the box, we play with it and we try it on, and all of a sudden it begins to change us from the inside out. But we know that we can take grace for granted. And it may seem like we're living in a house of grace, but in reality, grace continues to stay in the box. Friends, living in the house of grace allows us to surrender to Jesus, and we can receive this grace. And when we receive this grace, it changes us from the inside out. It changes the way that we see our community. It changes the way that we see our world. It changes the way that we even read Scripture. When we live in the house of grace, we no longer have to look over our backs to make sure that our goods outweigh our bads, because love doesn't keep score. When we dwell in the house of grace, that grace shapes us, just like the houses that we live in shapes us. When we dwell in the house of grace, through the Spirit, we are able to cry out, Abba, Father. When we dwell in the house of grace, grace internalizes us, and we realize that we can more than happily share what's going on in our lives, not because we're just trying to be more vulnerable, be more authentic, but we know that we have the power of God deep within us, and we are all children of God. And yes, we all go through certain things, but the reality of living in the house of grace is that this house of grace, when we dwell in this house of grace, it shapes us. This week, I opened up my door to my back door, and for the last 3.5 years or so, we've lived in this house, and every time I open up this door, which is probably like 10 times a day, it makes the loudest noise ever. It makes the loudest noise ever. And after 3.5 years, I finally made the decision I needed to do something about it. It literally took me 10 seconds to do something about it and to fix it. 10 seconds. And I had this realization that how often do we live in a house that you know the picture is a little crooked, and all we need to do is just go to the wall and fix the picture to straighten it out? Or how often do we walk past that thing that we need to fix, but we just continue to leave it as is and say we'll get to it later? But when in reality we just need to make a decision to fix that picture or to fix that door. Friends, I think living in the house of law, we have to make a decision. Are we comfortable living in the house of law, or do we long to live in the house of grace? Now, this isn't just for the person who is trying to decide whether they want to have a relationship with Jesus or not, but this is for the person who has walked with Jesus for a really long time and still continues to struggle with approval, still continues to struggle with fear, still continues to struggle with whatever it is that you struggle with. Are you willing today to make a decision to fix that thing that needs to be fixed, because we know that we have the Spirit of God that dwells deep inside of us, and when we tap into that Spirit of God, we cry out, Abba, Father. And I think some of us struggle even with that language, because some of us have had difficult relationships with our parents. Even calling God Abba, Father, or thinking of God as Mother is a struggle for us, because we didn't have that great relationship with God. For so many of us, I think our house were houses of laws, and we had to gain approval. And everything that we did, it was like we were under a microscope. We had to make sure that we made our parents proud. But as much as we tried and as often as we tried, we just never did. And so when we cry out, Abba, Father, it doesn't necessarily feel great because we never had that great relationship with our parents. Or maybe it's not necessarily our parents, but maybe it's yourself. You find difficulty finding approval within yourself, or you find difficulty forgiving yourself. And so we would just prefer to live in the house of law. But friends, what I would encourage us all to do today is make that decision. It takes 1 second to make a decision to say, I'm going to change this one thing, to move from the house of law into the house of grace. Because guess what, folks? Jesus not only invites you into the house of grace, but Jesus makes a place for you at the table. Jesus makes a place for you at the table and says, I don't care what you have done. I don't care what you are doing. I don't care how you feel like you have to come to the table. I just invite you as you are. Come to this table. Experience living and dwelling in the house of grace. And as you experience and as you dwell in the house of grace, things begin to change. But friends, constantly we are in a place of looking at our house and seeing how we can rearrange it to dwell longer and longer in this house of grace. Jesus not only invites you to dwell in the house of grace, but Jesus makes a place for you at the table. So what is that one thing, friends? What is that one thing that you need to rearrange, that you need to fix, that you need to spray some WD-40, that you need to straighten out in your life, so that you move from the house of law, the house of condemnation, the house of guilt, the house of anger, the house of whatever it is that you might live in? What is it that you need to move from the house of law into the house of grace? Because friends, Jesus sacrificed so that you can dwell in the house of grace. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took a loaf of bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body. It's broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, he took the cup and poured the wine. He said, this cup is a new covenant of my blood. A new promise. A new promise for you. As often as you drink it, do so in remembrance of me. Remember what I have done for you. Remember that I have called you out of the house of law into the house of grace. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you're proclaiming my death until I come again. Friends, let's no longer be complacent with that crooked mirror or that rusty old door. Let's make a decision right now to move out of the house of the law into the house of grace. If you need some help thinking through how you might do that, if you need some prayer moving into the house of grace, we would love to pray with you in the back. We have gluten-free option here if that is something that you need. And we just welcome all of you to this table. If you want to get connected with us, you can also fill out the Next Steps card and I'll follow up with you personally. Friends, these good gifts